June 6, 1944. While Adolf Hitler focused on the Allied landings in Normandy, convinced this was the decisive battle that would determine the war's outcome, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood in a command post 1,500 kilometers to the east, finalizing plans for an offensive that would dwarf the Normandy invasion in scale, violence, and consequences. Operation Bagration, named after the Russian general who had fought Napoleon, would commit 2.3 million men, 5,200 tanks, and 36,000 artillery pieces against the weakened center of Germany's Eastern Front. Hitler had no idea what was coming. The Führer's attention remained fixed westward. In the 3 weeks following D-Day, he obsessed over every report from France, convinced the Allies would collapse against his Atlantic wall defenses once he concentrated his panzer reserves properly. His daily military conferences in the Berghof focused almost exclusively on the Western Front. When staff officers tried to discuss the concerning buildup of Soviet forces opposite Army Group Center, Hitler waved them away. The Soviets, he insisted, would attack in the south toward the Romanian oil fields. They always went for the oil. It was obvious. General Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, knew better. His intelligence officers had identified massive Soviet concentrations directly across from his positions in Belorussia. Partisan activity had increased dramatically. Soviet reconnaissance patrols probed German lines nightly. Radio intercepts suggested something enormous was being prepared. On June 15th, Busch flew to Berchtesgaden to request permission to withdraw his forward divisions to more defensible positions and create mobile reserves. He needed flexibility to respond to the coming storm. Hitler refused to see him for 2 days. When the meeting finally occurred, the Führer barely let Busch speak. The general managed to present his intelligence estimates, the concerning Soviet buildup, the vulnerable position of his forward divisions. Hitler cut him off. Those forward positions would be held. Every meter of ground would be defended. Had Busch learned nothing from the winter battles? Retreat meant collapse. Defense meant survival. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. Busch flew back to his headquarters with nothing. The real problem was Hitler's fortress city doctrine. Throughout the spring of 1944, he had designated dozens of cities and towns across the Eastern Front as Feste Plätze, fortified places that must be held at all costs. These garrisons would tie down Soviet forces, disrupt their logistics, and serve as anchors for the defensive line. In theory, the concept had merit. In practice, it scattered German strength across dozens of isolated positions that could be bypassed and destroyed piecemeal. Army Group Center had 4 major fortress cities: Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. Each garrison numbered between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Once surrounded, they would be trapped. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, had argued against the fortress city policy for months. In conference after conference, he pointed out the obvious flaw. These garrisons would be annihilated if the Soviets achieved a breakthrough. Better to keep forces mobile, able to respond to threats. Hitler's response never varied. The cities would be held. Commanders who suggested retreat were defeatists. Defeatists would be relieved. By June of 1944, Zeitzler had stopped arguing. He was exhausted, suffering from nervous strain, and increasingly certain that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. June 23, 1944, 4:05 in the morning. 36,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously along a 450-kilometer front. The bombardment was so intense that German soldiers in bunkers 30 meters underground felt the earth shake. Trees splintered, entire trenches collapsed, communications lines disintegrated. In some sectors, the barrage lasted 2 hours. In others, it continued for 4. German units that had survived 3 years of Eastern Front combat had never experienced anything like this. The sound alone drove men mad. Lieutenant Heinrich Eberbach, 22 years old, commanded a platoon of the 31st Infantry Division near Vitebsk. He had survived Stalingrad, been wounded twice, and considered himself hardened to war. When the Soviet barrage began, he was in a forward observation post, a reinforced bunker that was supposed to withstand anything. The first salvo of Katyusha rockets hit so close that the concussion threw him against the concrete wall. His ears bled. He couldn't hear his own screaming. The bunker's single electric light went out. In the darkness, he felt the walls crack. Dust filled his lungs. He was certain he would be buried alive. The barrage lifted at 6:30. Eberbach crawled out of the bunker to find his platoon's positions obliterated. Of 38 men, he found 11 alive. 3 were so shell-shocked they couldn't stand. The telephone line to battalion headquarters was dead. He tried the radio. Static. Through the smoke and dust, he saw movement. Soviet infantry, thousands of them, advancing in waves behind a wall of tanks. He had 2 machine guns still operational and perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition. The battle lasted 14 minutes. Eberbach survived by playing dead under the bodies of his men. Soviet soldiers walked past him twice. He lay there for 6 hours, covered in blood, listening to the sounds of Army Group Center dying. At the Berghof, Hitler was asleep when the offensive began. His schedule had shifted entirely to late nights and late mornings. He typically went to bed around 4 in the morning and rose around noon. Staff officers knew better than to wake him except for the most critical emergencies. The duty officer that morning, receiving the first fragmentary reports of massive Soviet attacks, made a decision. The Führer would be informed at his regular waking time. It was probably a local attack anyway. The Soviets were always probing. No need to disturb the Führer's rest. Hitler woke at 11:45. He bathed, dressed, took his usual medications, and arrived for lunch at 1 in the afternoon. Only then was he informed that Soviet forces had launched major attacks against Army Group Center. How major? The reports were still coming in. Heavy fighting at Vitebsk, strong attacks near Orsha, probing actions along the entire front. Hitler listened, ate his vegetarian meal, and asked if this was the main Soviet offensive or a diversion. His military adjutant, Major Bernd Freitag von Loringhoven, admitted they didn't know yet. Hitler nodded. They would know soon enough. The afternoon military conference would address it. By the time that conference began at 4 o'clock, the true scale of Bagration was becoming clear. Soviet forces had achieved breakthroughs in multiple sectors. The 3rd Panzer Army at Vitebsk was being enveloped. The 9th Army near Bobruisk faced massive armored assaults. The 4th Army's front was crumbling. General Adolf Heusinger, Chief of Operations, presented the situation with maps and casualty estimates. Multiple divisions had lost contact with the headquarters. Soviet tank columns were driving deep into German rear areas. Army Group Center was requesting permission to withdraw to the Berezina River, a fallback position that could be defended. Hitler's face reddened. Who was requesting this? General Bush, through his Chief of Staff. Hitler slammed his hand on the table. Bush again, always Bush with his retreat proposals. The answer was no. The fortress cities would hold. The line would hold. Mobile reserves would be committed to seal any breakthroughs. He turned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command. Where were the panzer divisions? Keitel consulted his notes. The 12th Panzer Division was in transit from the south. The 20th Panzer Division was refitting near Minsk. The 5th Panzer Division was in Poland. Hitler pointed at the map. Send them all to Bush. Seal the breakthrough. Destroy the Soviet spearheads. The conference lasted 3 hours. Every request for retreat was denied. Lieutenant Eberbach, still lying among corpses near Vitebsk, finally moved after dark. Soviet forces had pushed past his position, advancing westward. He crawled south, following a drainage ditch, until he reached what had been his company's command post. It was a crater. He found 2 other survivors from his battalion. Together, they walked west through the night, avoiding roads, hiding from Soviet patrols. They had no food, no water, no idea where German lines were anymore. On the second day, they encountered a column of German trucks fleeing westward. The trucks were overloaded with wounded. The driver of one truck told them Vitebsk was surrounded. The entire garrison, 35,000 men, was trapped. The 3 soldiers climbed onto a truck bed already carrying 12 wounded men. The truck drove west, part of a disorganized stream of vehicles fleeing the Soviet advance. June 25, 1944. Hitler's morning briefing brought worse news. Vitebsk was completely encircled. The garrison commander, Lieutenant General Friedrich Gollwitzer, reported he was down to 3 days of ammunition and 1 day of food. Soviet forces had cut all supply routes. He requested permission to break out. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. Vitebsk would be held. It was a fortress city. Fortress cities did not surrender. Fortress cities did not retreat. Gollwitzer would hold his position and tie down Soviet forces. Relief columns were being organized. The breakout request was denied. General Zeitzler, present at the briefing, made one final attempt. He pointed out that the relief columns didn't exist. The panzer divisions Hitler had ordered forward were still days away. Vitebsk's garrison would be destroyed for no strategic purpose. Better to let them break out, preserve those 35,000 men for the defense of Minsk. Hitler turned on him with sudden fury. Was Zeitzler a defeatist now? Did he want to abandon every position? Did he want to retreat all the way to Berlin? Zeitzler, his voice shaking, said he wanted to preserve the army. Hitler told him the army would be preserved by holding ground, not by running away. The briefing ended. Zeitzler walked out, returned to his office, and began drafting his resignation. In Vitebsk, General Gollwitzer received Hitler's order to hold. He read it twice, then called his senior commanders together. They met in a basement bunker while Soviet artillery pounded the city above them. Gollwitzer was 51 years old, a career officer who had served in the First World War and been decorated for bravery. He was not a Nazi, not a fanatic, but a professional soldier who followed orders. He told his commanders they would hold Vitebsk. They would fight for every building, every street. When ammunition ran out, they would fight with bayonets. When food ran out, they would eat their horses. They would follow their orders. 3 of the commanders protested. Gollwitzer cut them off. The decision was made. The meeting lasted 8 minutes. The garrison held for 4 more days. Soviet forces didn't bother with a direct assault. They simply tightened the ring, brought up heavy artillery, and methodically destroyed the city block by block. German soldiers fought from the rubble, then from the basements, then from the sewers. On June 27th, ammunition ran critically low. On June 28th, the last horses were slaughtered for food. On June 29th, Soviet tanks entered the city center. General Gollwitzer, down to fewer than 8,000 effective soldiers, finally ordered a breakout attempt without permission. It failed. Soviet forces had anticipated it. Of the 8,000 men who tried to escape, fewer than 1,400 made it through Soviet lines. Gollwitzer was captured. The Vitebsk garrison ceased to exist. Hitler was not informed of Vitebsk's fall until the evening of June 30th. He was meeting with Albert Speer, discussing armaments production, when an aide brought the message. Hitler read it, set it aside, and continued his conversation with Speer about tank production quotas. Only after Speer left did Hitler summon his military staff. He wanted to know how Vitebsk had fallen. Had Gollwitzer followed orders? Had he held to the last? The staff officer presenting the report explained that the garrison had held for 7 days against overwhelming odds before attempting a breakout. Hitler interrupted. Gollwitzer had attempted a breakout without permission. That was desertion. That was cowardice. Gollwitzer would be court-martialed. The officer pointed out that Gollwitzer was now a Soviet prisoner. Hitler said the court-martial would proceed in absentia. Gollwitzer's family would be arrested. His name would be stricken from the rolls. The same day Vitebsk fell, Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Bobruisk. The garrison there numbered 40,000 men under General Anton von Bechtolsheim. Unlike Vitebsk, Bobruisk sat on a major road junction that the Soviets actually needed to capture. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the First Belarusian Front, committed 2 entire armies to reducing the pocket. The assault began July 1st with a bombardment that made the opening barrage of Bagration seem mild. Rokossovsky had concentrated 1,200 guns on a garrison that held a perimeter just 8 kilometers across. The shelling lasted 6 hours. Buildings disintegrated. The earth itself seemed to liquefy. German soldiers who survived described it as the end of the world. General Bechtolsheim, sheltering in a reinforced bunker that shook so violently he couldn't stand, sent an urgent message to Army Group Center headquarters. He was being annihilated. He needed immediate relief or permission to break out. He received a response within 2 hours. It was not from Army Group Center. It was directly from Hitler's headquarters. Bobruisk would be held. It was a fortress city. Relief was being organized. Bechtolsheim would hold his position. The message was signed by Hitler personally. Bechtolsheim held for 2 more days. On July 3rd, with Soviet tanks inside the city and his perimeter collapsing, he organized a breakout without permission. He had no choice. His men were out of ammunition, out of food, out of hope. The breakout began at dawn. 16,000 men tried to fight their way through Soviet lines. Soviet forces, expecting exactly this, had positioned their best troops along the escape routes. They had artillery pre-registered on every possible exit. They had tanks positioned to create killing zones. The breakout became a massacre. Soviet soldiers later described the roads as rivers of blood. Of the 16,000 men who attempted to escape, approximately 7,000 made it through. Bechtolsheim was not among them. He was killed by machine gun fire in the first hour. July 3rd, 1944. The same day Bobruisk fell, Soviet forces entered Minsk, the capital of Belarusia. A city of 250,000 people before the war, had been designated a fortress city. The garrison, however, had already fled. The commander, recognizing that defending Minsk was suicide, had ordered a withdrawal despite Hitler's orders. Soviet tanks rolled into an empty city. Partisans emerged from hiding to greet them. Red flags appeared on buildings. The German occupation of Minsk, which had lasted exactly 3 years, was over. Hitler received the news of Minsk's fall during his evening conference. He was already in a foul mood. Reports from Normandy indicated the Allies were breaking out of their beachhead. The fortress city of Cherbourg had just surrendered despite orders to hold. Now Minsk was gone, and the commander had withdrawn without permission. Hitler demanded the commander's name. When informed, he ordered the officer arrested immediately, court-martialed for desertion, and shot. Field Marshal Keitel pointed out that the commander was already dead, killed during the withdrawal. Hitler said the court-martial would proceed anyway. The commander's family would be punished. His name would be dishonored. Officers who disobeyed orders would learn the consequences. General Zeitzler, still nominally chief of the Army General Staff, though he had submitted his resignation, made one final intervention. He pointed out that Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. 28 divisions had been destroyed or encircled. Soviet forces had advanced 350 kilometers in 10 days. There was now a gap in the German line 400 kilometers wide. The Soviets could drive straight to the Polish border unopposed. The only solution was to withdraw forces from other sectors, establish a new defensive line, and abandon the fortress city policy that had proven so catastrophic. Hitler's response was to relieve Zeitzler effective immediately. The general had proven himself a defeatist and a pessimist. He was dismissed from all positions and forbidden to wear his uniform. His replacement would be General Heinz Guderian, who understood the importance of offensive spirit. The meeting ended. Zeitzler left the room and never returned. He spent the rest of the war under house arrest, forbidden to speak publicly, his career destroyed for telling Hitler the truth. The same day, Hitler also relieved General Busch as commander of Army Group Center. The official reason was health concerns. The actual reason was that Busch had presided over the greatest German military defeat since Stalingrad. His replacement was Field Marshal Walter Model, known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts. Model arrived at Army Group Center headquarters on July 4th to find that Army Group Center barely existed. Of the original 47 divisions under Busch's command, 31 had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. Soviet forces had captured or killed approximately 350,000 German soldiers. Equipment losses included 2,000 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 57,000 vehicles. The disaster was so complete that Soviet forces had difficulty processing the prisoners. Columns of captured German soldiers stretched for kilometers. Model's first action was to fly to Hitler's headquarters and request permission to establish a new defensive line along the Vistula River in Poland. This would require abandoning all of Belorussia and most of Lithuania, but it was the only way to create a stable front. Hitler refused. Every meter of ground would be contested. The advance would be stopped through counterattacks. Model, who had a reputation for speaking bluntly even to Hitler, pointed out that counterattacks required forces he didn't have. Hitler promised reinforcements. 15 divisions would be transferred from other fronts. Model would stop the Soviet advance and then retake Minsk. Model returned to his headquarters, knowing the promised reinforcements would never arrive or would arrive too late. He began organizing a fighting retreat, conducting delaying actions, trading space for time, trying to preserve what remained of his forces. He ignored Hitler's orders when necessary, followed them when possible, and did his best to save his army from complete annihilation. It was all he could do. Lieutenant Eberbach, the young officer who had survived the initial barrage near Vitebsk, spent 2 weeks moving west with the flood of German refugees. He saw things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Columns of prisoners being marched east, villages burning, bodies everywhere. German soldiers who had given up, sitting by the roadside waiting to be captured. Officers who had shot themselves rather than face the shame. On July 15th, he reached what remained of German lines near Grodno. He reported to a replacement battalion being formed from stragglers and survivors. The battalion commander asked him his rank. Lieutenant, his age. 22. His experience. 3 years on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, multiple wounds. The commander made him a company commander on the spot. The company consisted of 63 men, most of them over 40, pulled from rear area units. They had rifles, but no machine guns, no anti-tank weapons, no artillery support. They were sent to hold a village against Soviet forces that outnumbered them 20-1. Back at the Bergshof, Hitler's daily conferences increasingly focused on assigning blame. Generals had failed him. The fortress city policy had been correct. The commanders had implemented it poorly. If Vitebsk's garrison had held longer, if Bobruisk's commander hadn't panicked, if Busch had shown more offensive spirit, the outcome would have been different. The problem wasn't the strategy. The problem was the execution. The problem was the men. Field Marshal Keitel, who attended every conference, never contradicted Hitler. He nodded agreement, took notes, issued orders he knew were impossible to execute. Other officers called him Lakitel, a pun on his name suggesting he was a lackey. But Keitel survived, which was more than could be said for officers who spoke truth to power. He watched as Hitler grew increasingly detached from reality, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, planning counter-offensives with forces that would never materialize, convinced that willpower alone could reverse military disaster. By mid-July, Operation Bagration had achieved everything the Soviet High Command had hoped for and more. Army Group Center was destroyed. The road to Poland lay open. German forces were in full retreat across a 500-kilometer front. Soviet casualties had been heavy, approximately 180,000 dead and wounded, but they had inflicted losses 5 times greater on the Germans. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was no longer capable of defending even when fighting from prepared positions. The myth of German military superiority, already damaged at Stalingrad and Kursk, was shattered completely. The offensive continued through July and into August. Soviet forces liberated all of Belarusia, most of Lithuania, and drove into Poland. They reached the outskirts of Warsaw by late July, triggering the Warsaw Uprising that would end in tragedy. But that was another story. For Hitler, the lesson of Bagration was not that his strategy had failed. It was that his generals had failed him. He would trust them less, interfere more, and make decisions increasingly divorced from military reality. On July the 20th, 1944, less than a month after Bagration began, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted in his conference room. The attempt failed. Hitler survived with minor injuries. In the aftermath, he became convinced that the military defeats were not the result of Soviet strength or German weakness, but of betrayal. Traitors in the officer corps were sabotaging his orders. Defeatists were spreading pessimism. The purge that followed destroyed what remained of the German military's professional leadership. Lieutenant Eberbach survived the war. His improvised company held their village for 3 days before being overrun. He was wounded again, evacuated to a field hospital, and eventually made his way back to Germany. After the war, he was interviewed by American military historians studying the Eastern Front. They asked him about Operation Bagration, about the fortress city policy, about Hitler's leadership. Eberbach chose his words carefully. He said that soldiers followed orders, even orders that made no sense, even orders that guaranteed their death. He said that Vitebsk could have been evacuated, that 35,000 men could have been saved to fight another day. He said that Bobruisk didn't need to become a death trap, that Minsk didn't need to be defended. He said that Hitler's insistence on holding every meter of ground had destroyed Army Group Center as surely as Soviet artillery. Then Eberbach said something the historians found striking. He said that in the bunker near Vitebsk, during those first terrible hours of the Soviet barrage, he had been certain he would die. He had been terrified, but he had also been clear-minded. He knew exactly what was happening. The Soviets were destroying his position with overwhelming force, and there was nothing he could do about it. But 1,500 kilometers away, in a comfortable room in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler was asleep. And when Hitler woke up and learned what was happening, he would issue orders based not on reality, but on ideology. He would demand the impossible, punish those who failed to achieve it, and blame everyone except himself. That, Eberbach said, was the real tragedy of Operation Bagration. Not the Soviet attack, which was brilliant and devastating, but the German response, which was delusional and suicidal. What did Hitler say when the Soviets launched Operation Bagration? He said hold. He said fight. He said no retreat. He said the fortress cities would stand. He said relief was coming. He said victory was possible through willpower. He said commanders who suggested withdrawal were defeatists. He said the line would hold. He said the enemy would be destroyed. He said all of this while Army Group Center was being annihilated, while 350,000 German soldiers were being killed or captured, while the Eastern Front was collapsing, while his own military leadership was telling him the truth he refused to hear. And when it was over, when the disaster was complete and undeniable, Hitler said it was the generals' fault. They had failed him. They had lacked offensive spirit. They had been defeatist. They had not followed orders properly. The strategy had been sound, the execution had been flawed. Given better commanders, given more loyal officers, given soldiers who truly believed, the outcome would have been different. He never admitted that the fortress city policy was a catastrophe. He never acknowledged that refusing to allow retreat had trapped and destroyed entire armies. He never accepted that his interference in military operations had made a bad situation infinitely worse. He never learned the lesson that Bagration should have taught him, that ideology cannot defeat artillery, that willpower cannot stop tanks, that orders cannot change reality. Instead, Hitler doubled down. In the months that followed, he would repeat the same mistakes on the Western Front, in Hungary, in the final defense of Germany itself. He would continue to issue impossible orders, relieve commanders who told him the truth, and blame everyone except himself for the disasters that followed. Operation Bagration was not an aberration. It was a template. It showed exactly how Hitler would lead Germany to destruction, one delusional order at a time, convinced until the very end that victory was possible if only his subordinates had sufficient will to achieve it. In the ruins of Vitebsk, in the killing fields around Bobruisk, in the roads choked with German prisoners marching east, the evidence of his delusion was written in blood. But Hitler never visited those places. He never saw the results of his orders. He stayed in his headquarters, surrounded by maps and yes-men, issuing commands to armies that no longer existed, planning offensives with divisions that had been destroyed, convinced that reality would bend to his will if he simply refused to accept it. That was what Hitler said when the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, and that was why Germany lost the war.